Outa-space, International Arts and Class Struggle podcast. In this week's show, Divided Sweden Part 2. Zero Tolerance Graffiti and Art Representation. Music by Wako aka Nazca, with a song called Ellos, Dicen. Okay, today we're joined by Daniel Terres. Hi, Daniel. How you doing?
Fine.
Cool, man. Well, thanks for coming on the show. Daniel works for Gothenburg City Council with the urban arts. He's a podcaster. He's a passionate builder of the arts. I think also originally immigrant from Argentina. An enabler of people, and generally a smiley, happy, positive face for any artist doing work in the Gothenburg area. So, hey, Daniel, that's who I think you are, but who do you think you are?
Well, yeah, I don't define myself as somebody working at the municipality, but I had to pay the rent, so it happens. Anyway.
Well, that is your job, and that is your job, though, yeah?
That's my job, yeah. But I'm still very engaged when it comes to self-organizing, community service at grassroots level.
I am an immigrant living in Sweden. I am very proud about that. I'm working as a project manager, and I'm a producer within arts in Sweden.
I'm formally educated within social work in the field of social pedagogy.
Okay.
Yeah, when I was 20 years old, I came in contact with the landless workers movement in Brazil, probably one of the biggest social movements in Latin America. And that's what got me into social work, actually.
Okay.
And I've been serving the community in different ways in the field of addiction care mostly, almost around 6-7 years.
In public institutions and health services in Sweden. And since 2013, I am working as a producer and project manager, mostly within public art and culture, but I am pretty much into community and grassroots movements.
Yes, I think that's. I mean, also, when I said you're a passionate builder of the arts, and I think you're much more than your job title.
I hope
yes,
so.
I know so. I mean, the way I've come across you and the passion I see that you fight for the community and fight for the arts, I think you're perfect for this podcast. So what I really want to sort of talk about today, because I think there's a lot of things that you and me could go into with this podcast in time, but I kind of want to develop. I'd had a discussion with Christopher Lundberg in Hammarkullen, and I've also been in Hammarkullen myself, and we talked a little bit about the model of the scene there. But what I wanted to develop today to start with was a little bit more of the wider picture of Gothenburg, and the idea that Gothenburg is one of the most segregated cities in Europe, and I wonder if you could explain that a little bit more.
Yeah, of course. First, before I keep going, I want to say sorry because my very basic English, I don't have any formal education when it comes to English. I learned mostly in the street with friends, and I did it as an adult.
And I studied some English at high school the last year.
I think most people will appreciate that your communication skills are very high.
Yeah, Swedish cities belongs to the most racially segregated cities in Europe. It is important to highlight the fact. As you have seen when you came to Sweden, I know you've been here 3 times at least.
3 or 4 actually.
But it has to do with the welfare state that has stepped back of the urban and housing policy that constitute the cornerstones in the construction of this post-war welfare state. And this process can perhaps best be defined as a neoliberal re-engineering of the welfare state.
But of course, it has to do also with structural racism and the logics of the market in such a society that are affecting mostly people with non-European background, immigrants, and even Swedish people that are non-white.
Yeah, I mean, I think when I talked a bit before about the Swedish model being one of some sort of social democratic dream, and it's when I first came to Sweden, I didn't think that was true, but when I actually came and saw it, it's completely not true. You know, it's the suburbs are where, you know, you said it yourself, racially segregated, but also it's a class segregation as well, clearly, but really, really obvious, you know. And for me, that was really also reflected in the arts, because, you know, I spent a day when I first came going around and looking at the art in the city, you know, and I went to the museums, and it's a match for lots of cities around the world. And then I went to the suburbs, and the contrast could not be different. I mean, could you say a little bit about how urban arts exists in Gothenburg under this situation?
Well, I use urban art as a very specific term for referring me to the art that are using the aesthetics of street art and graffiti, but at the same time are operating under the logics of the market and the institutions. But of course, there is art and culture outside the institutions and outside the market. What we call for urban culture here, what people recognize as urban culture here, often has its center in the periphery, and it's a very dynamic, ever evolving, and creative space that people use to create a publicness that otherwise is neglected to them. But there are many different creative expressions. But I think all these labels we are giving to cultural and art expressions mean something, right? It's gonna give different levels of autonomy and freedom. And I think there is also a very implicit hierarchy in that. And of course, everything that is recognized as urban culture and art has a much lower hierarchy within the institutions.
Okay, so you're kind of you're kind of saying then that the energy of arts creation comes from the suburbs, you know, whether, yeah, but it's not reflected in the official art scene in
Well, as I told
Gothenburg.
you, I think there are very implicit hierarchies. For example, I am working at an art institution within the city of Gothenburg, and this institution gonna be almost 100 years old, and I am probably the first brown person with non-European background working there with a full-time salary. When it comes to public institutions, this situation is not an exception, but I could say normality. We are talking about a city where more than 50% of the population have some kind of immigrant background, most of them non-European background. So we are talking about a huge crisis when it comes to representation. It's gonna have a huge impact in how we redistribute or distribute the foundings and what kind of public and audiences are important for the institution. And I think when it comes to quality, this is defined by a nexus or intersection between class and ethnicity that are excluding a large group of the population. And in a way also creating a monopoly when it comes to defining quality and when it comes to access to what I call publicness. Well, in a way, this reality reflects what I call an old Swedish tradition that's called racism. And when it comes to the topics we were talking about before, it is important to remember that Sweden have something that's called zero tolerance against graffiti in many municipalities. And these kind of policies have a huge impact when it comes to urban culture and art today.
Racism's an old Swedish tradition.
Yeah, it is.
you mentioned zero tolerance in your sentence back there, and I think there's around graffiti wasn't there a zero intolerance policy for a number of years in Gothenburg. Could you explain that a little bit?
I came here around 2005, so I can't tell you about the modern history of zero tolerance in Sweden. But yeah, it was about different policies that were implemented in many different municipalities around 2006, 2007, in Stockholm, for example, where they tried to regulate the graffiti removal. So it was basically based in fast graffiti removal within 24 and 48 hours, surveillance, about even information campaigns demonizing the aesthetics of graffiti and the graffiti writers, talking about it as a first step into much heavier criminality and drug addiction and as a way of eroding the good society. And also it has to do with some kind of what I could translate as a censorship to the aesthetics of graffiti, because municipalities that were using these policies were held back from having any kind of collaboration or cooperation with culture and art activities or initiatives that were using this kind of aesthetics.
So fundamentally, a really conservative attitude towards what graffiti stood for,
Yeah,
what
it
it
was very
meant.
conservative. It also have a huge effect or impact when it comes to public art. Yeah, well, many public servants and institutions within the municipality started to stigmatize different kind of art initiatives. So it was very difficult for the common people to get permission for doing a mural, for example, or a street art festival. So it became a very anti-democratic way of approaching public art. And of course, it has huge consequences when it comes to participation and representation and who has access to the public space and who can define what kind of public art we're gonna have in our communities, what is seen as quality or good art, for example.
Well, see, for me, I think like murals and graffiti art and this kind of thing is one of the most democratic forms of artistic expression because everybody can see it, and anybody can do it. Now, obviously, sometimes I can understand that maybe a rubbish tagging sort of thing doesn't always appeal to everybody, but actually, this kind of art is really expressive and can be really fantastic, and so. I guess if they had this, you have this scenario where you have a segregated population. You have people living in the suburbs. It's class segregated, it's racially segregated, and culturally segregated. And there was a zero intolerance, we'll call it, policy, which I believe that now, though, that's the zero tolerance policies ended. No, am I correct?
Well, when it comes to private property, it is a crime to trespass it or paint it without permission, with graffiti, of course, and that kind of decisions are not taken by the municipalities. But when it comes to the aesthetics of graffiti and street art within public art and public institutions, well, there are many cities that still are trying to exercise some kind of, I could not say censorship, but they are very active excluding that kind of artistic expressions. But well, when it comes to Gothenburg, for example, we have changed the translation of the policy. I have been working very active to achieve a new praxis or a new practice when it comes to this policy, where the municipality no longer can exclude certain kind of aesthetics as graffiti, street art, for example, and where initiatives are being included also. But the problem is still the lack of public funding when it comes to art that it's not decided by a commission that's coming upside down.
Well, this for me, is interesting because I have an insight, but obviously the listeners don't. That actually the response to that, the Hamakulan project that I knew you were project managing with, the urban art, the urban Hamakulan Urban Arts Project, where there's ginormous graffitis done. Well, there weren't graffitis; there were murals, but and I witnessed that, and I think that response, and I think if you go to some of the other sort of suburbs, you can see other graffitis like that. So the fact that there's been this zero tolerance, the response to that is quite fantastic.
Yeah, it is. But it's not the end of zero tolerance when it comes to graffiti. What you have seen is a diversification of public art, I would say. And there is still a lack of public funding. In the internal discussions within the municipality, this tendency to see this kind of initiative as something else than art. They often see this kind of public art as something else, more like an instrument for integration or some kind of community project or social project. So there is a very implicit hierarchy, and it will give to the art a different level of autonomy and access to public funding. So many initiatives have to do cooperations with the private companies in order to get fundings for doing this kind of public art. And that has a huge impact in the autonomy because many of these festivals at the end become some kind of city branding or in the worst case some kind of gentrification project too.
Yeah, because sometimes you can get rid of the official policy, but the attitude remains, eh?
Yeah, mostly. And I have been working so many years to achieve what you have seen. And I think it's the same situation for many other organizations and people and artists working in the same field. And of course, this is a learning process for me at least. And I have made many mistakes, and I regret some cooperations, as perhaps Artscape 2016, that it was two sides. It was good because the organization kind of gave the security that the municipality and many municipal companies were demanding. That was this kind of beautification kind of projects that are very cheesy, I would say, but at the same time it was a good strategy to get them into this kind of large mural festivals that opened the doors to other initiatives that were much better, more radical. And I am very proud about other projects as Berg Urban Art 18 and Hammarkullen Urban Art 17, where you have participated, Rob, for example.
Well, I want to ask you just about, maybe we'll move on a little bit, but I want to ask you about one particular mural, and that's Nabila's Fist in Hammarkullen, because anybody who enters Hammarkullen will see a ginormous fist of struggle on the side of one of the buildings, and it's also fascinating piece of work because you go up closely and it's like a fractal sort of design, and inside the fist is 1,000 windows, and inside those windows is the people of the community, and that fist for me really symbolizes this discussion, but I don't suppose that was universally popular, was it?
No, maybe not. Well, I didn't hear any complaints, but a few ones. I know that some public servants were talking that it can be translated into something violent. But well, I think art is for freedom, and I think public space shouldn't be a space for consensus, but for conflict.
I mean, I think it was a challenge, and I think it was a festival that was asking some serious questions, and particularly that piece of art, was saying, well, this is what this community does feel like, certainly a section of it. It was reflecting, if you like, this problem that we were talking about before, about segregation, about racial segregation of people, class segregation, and then there was a symbol of what is a worldwide symbol of struggle, is a fist.
Yeah, it's a fist of struggle. Nabila is a very well-known activist in the suburb. I respect her a lot. And as you have already said, there were many artworks that were critical, that were reflecting the reality of migration in Europe, of struggle in a neighborhood that never got anything for free. I mean, there is a very big tradition of struggle, community, resistance, and self-organizing. Now, I would say all the artists that came to the festival have a working class background. They have immigrant background in Sweden, or they were brought from Mexico, from Chile, from coming from Spain and England, with very similar experience of this kind of working class reality. It was not an unfamiliar situation to see and the adults coming late night from work, similar housing conditions, and of course it was not only my initiative. It was a collaboration with many local organizations as Hammarkullen 365, the local tenant syndicate. So I think the artists connected very easily to the situation and to the people in the neighborhood. They were living there around 3-4 weeks, some of them even longer because they stay after the festival. Many of these artists, they have been in Hammarkullen before, as Charky Punk from Chile, Himmel and Raven from Mexico. So it was kind of an already ongoing dialogue that brought something else to the table. It was not a beautification or decoration festival as many festivals out there that are so-called street art. It was something else. It was much deeper. It had different energy.
I mean, it brings me on to another question though, because I think a lot of people were a bit uncomfortable with it, because some people's idea of solving social problems is gentrification. And they think, and it's often, and this is a wider issue, and I'm going to discuss it more in many more podcasts, but it's often the artists who come into an area first, make the area kind of hip and cool with graffitis and workshops and this sort of stuff, but often it's the first step towards gentrification. And it comes with a load of other policies like privatization. We won't invest the money unless we clean up the area. And the rents go up, and then the people that lived there before move out. Is that a process that's going on in the suburbs in Gothenburg? Is that something that's happening?
Yeah, gentrification is pretty real here, and it's very violent. We have seen it in many different neighborhoods. And there is a tendency, there is a quite violent lobby when it comes to the idea of selling the public housing.
Yes, privatization. I mean, this is a particular thing that, I mean, maybe this has gone further in some other countries in the world, or maybe doesn't exist the same, but the suburb areas we're talking about are part of the Millions Home program, which, I think was in the 70s mainly. And it was a huge investment in public housing,
one of the few.
To the point now, though, where all that they're trying to roll that back, and this is part of the neoliberal project that continues.
Well, I think this kind of politics that are following this market rationality, making housing to a commodity and not a human right, are affecting communities in very different ways. For example, white Swedish people with low income, working class people will have different chances to navigate or to survive in this very sick housing market we have here in Sweden, for example. Because perhaps somebody with a Swedish name have a different access to the municipal market and to the private market. You as an immigrant only have access to the municipal market because they have a queue system that's based on point. But when it comes to private market, the racism is a big issue. If you have a name that tells that you are not European or that you probably are non-white, you're gonna have a huge impact when you're looking for a place to live. And I mean, even the municipal companies are adapted to the market, so the prices are very high. Even now, during this Corona crisis, the prices are getting higher. They didn't take any kind of social measure when it comes to that. Well, when it comes to art and gentrification, I don't know. I think art doesn't have the same effect in Sweden because we already have such an upside down kind of decision taking. Here is a total lack of direct democracy, so people don't participate in the decisions that gonna affect their living situation and their everyday life. That combined with a total lack of social housing, very, very high demand in the big cities, and very few investments when it comes to public or municipality owned housing. It's creating a very sick market where housing is not a human right. And it's getting worse when it comes to this kind of market rationality in Sweden. So since 2017, I'm not working anymore with permanent murals. I'm focusing on temporary interventions in the city and other kind of artistic projects because I don't want to be associated with any kind of process that can be linked or associated to any kind of gentrification logic.
I want to ask you another thing as well, which hit me when I first met you, because it resonated with me too. And I think you even have it on your Facebook. Is that you say art is a process? Yeah. What do you mean by that? Could you explain a little bit what you mean by art is a process? Because many people will think, oh, there's a beautiful piece of art, and let's tick the box. We've seen it, but is that really what art is to you?
For me, everything is a process. I'm more engaged, I'm more in love with the process and with the result. And I think when it comes to art, it's not different. When I talk about process, because I put in an emphasis when it comes to the experience and the relationships between the space, the artist, the space and the community and the artwork.
Yes, it's as much the participation of making the piece of work and the experience that you have than necessarily the result that's in front of you. And I think this is a challenge to the establishment because the establishment doesn't see art in that way.
I don't think art only have to do with participation, but it's the kind of process that I put a lot of emphasis when it comes to my work, because I really think that they have the potential to challenge the status quo and to create the publicness that is so often neglected to so many groups in society.
Yeah, maybe just sort of, because we're coming near to the end of our time, but I'm going to, in my normal style, I'm going to ask you a big question before we finish. And that's, the marketization of art, the commoditization of art. This is a problem. But how do you see that we can change it? What would be your sort of what would be your message about what? Because for me, it's a struggle. It's a fight. We're fighting not only for jobs and for housing and for rights and democracy. We're actually fighting for the right to express and be artistic. How would you see that fight's going to be in the next period? Do you have sort of a vision about what we need to do?
Wow, that's a big question. Pass. Well, I don't know. I think it's gonna be different in different cities. There are so many contexts, but I think it has to do with trying to find in every local context a way of radicalizing democracy. And I think we have to create new alternatives and challenge the neoliberal logics that are following the market rationality as a way of organizing every field in life and society. We already have seen the experience of that and how destructive and how anti-democratic it is. Well, when it comes to public art and to art in general, I think, well, it's the same. Has to do also with the radicalization of democracy, politics of representations. I think institutions have to become more democratic and more representative for society. Perhaps we have to remember to politicians and to public servants that they are simple service givers to the community. We have to find new ways to generate public funding or to redistribute public funding, to finance initiatives by the members of the community, public art that are not coming by exclusive commission process or upside down process. I think there are 100 different ways of thinking and creating public art that don't have to do with the commission, and I think that can liberate the arts, make them more inclusive and give us a more representative and more pluralistic public space, and also give us new visions of how to create or how to develop or evolve as a more pluralistic society, and it can give us or help us to create new ways of publicness and political participation.
Yeah, I think that's a good way to finish it for today, because I mean, those are big questions about how representation can be corrected or changed fundamentally. And I think you've given us a great flavor today of the situation in Gothenburg. But I would say that Gothenburg it's although it's one particular place, I think this discussion could be transposed into any major city, one way or the other.
I agree. At least in any westernized society.
Yeah. And I think one of the things we talk about representation, and I think that's important, but I also think we need to talk about organization, and communication between ourselves. Because if we want to change things, you can't do it by not knowing what's going on in Gothenburg.
Yeah, that's a great point, Rob. I think, yes, we have to keep networking and organizing, and not only claiming back the institutions that should belong to us, but also creating our own and creating new organizations and new visions that are not only reacting and answering to the power, but rather asking new questions and giving new answers to them. I think also as well.
I think that's Daniel. I think that's a brilliant way to end it. We have to create our own center and not basically respond to what the middle class want us to do. So on that note, we'll say goodbye today, but we're going to get you back. We're going to talk about more things, not just about Gothenburg. And I thank you very much for coming on the show, and we'll talk again soon. Yeah.
Oh, thank you for having me here, and I hope we can meet each other again in the streets of Barcelona or Gothenburg. I want to say I'm so sorry because my so basic English, and I hope people can understand at least 20% of what I have said.
No, I think you've done very well.
I know, you're just a good friend.
Don't worry, no, people understand. I mean, you've got something interesting to say, people will listen, and you have got something interesting to say. So, language is only a small problem that we can overcome, and I think you spoke very clearly.
Well, thank you very much, Rob, for giving me this time, for having with me this beautiful conversation.
Thanks again, Daniel. You've been brilliant, and we'll have a chat in the near future. See you now. So, hey, Paul, are you there up in the space station?
I am up in space, talking to you, looking down on the Earth.
Cool, man. So, what did you think to the Daniel Terres interview? What's your first thoughts on that one?
It's really interesting going into this off the back of our last session with Christopher, because it's part 2, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's still very much on my mind, our last session, and it's straight off the bat. Graffiti is the first thing that hits the ground running as a subject, and lots of stuff that attaches to that. Lots of thoughts about how it's a bona fide force for expressing people that might be in other ways powerless in some way. And anybody can do it, like you say, and everybody can see it, and those two things are perfectly placed. And straight away we've got Dan making that the thing and mentioning the zero tolerance issue. So you've got this expression, as you put it, it's like it's almost free to do graffiti. It's almost free to do it. Everybody can see it, and the state had this zero. Now you have to tell me more about that, because did this zero tolerance attitude that Sweden has in place to graffiti, was that a pre-existing law from way back before the immigration into the area from outside?
I can tell you what I know. I mean, Daniel himself said he only really goes back to, I think, 2005, he said in the interview. And it was a law that they had, which was, it was called zero tolerance to graffiti. And it's a bit like, one of these American 3 strikes and you're out kind of laws, I think, and it was basically, that they would do an immediate cleanup every time they saw graffiti, or they would have this idea that we're not, there should be no graffiti in the streets. They should be clean and, this kind of thing. And I think that the zero tolerance attitude to it had a knock-on effect, because what it meant was that the people who did graffiti came from certain sections of society. Like you were saying, it's a free thing. Anybody can do it. It can be a bit illegal if you're doing it on somebody's wall that doesn't want it, but in general, they're public walls where people do it. And I think it was this idea to have a cleaner, nicer environment on the basis of a certain aesthetic. Now, I think what Daniel was saying is that I don't think that law is there in the same way now. But the zero tolerance idea is like anything connected with that kind of art, what he was calling street art, if you like, art that was accessible for people, had this stigma put on it from that law that still to a certain degree continues today. And he was sort of explaining that to get funding and to get certain things to do that kind of urban art, I've got my fingers clicking at the moment with that you had to go through certain hoops and circles, and it's like an interventionist kind of way, and therefore it was squeezed, I think is the point he was coming from, and still is today. And that's why just a final point, that's why when we talked last week to Christopher about the Hammarkullen model and the ginormous murals, that was a response to that. It was like saying, well, we can't have graffitis in our streets and our areas, then we'll have fucking massive ones. I think the actual law is being changed, or the reading of it is being changed. But I think what I got from Daniel is actually nothing's really changed.
I mean, there's lots to get into there right away. The first thing I'm going to pick up on is I didn't understand the funding part of it. I'm glad you brought it up. So let me just, because that feels like a 2-tier problem. Zero tolerance as a legal sort of starting point that's been, it sounds like, negotiated with to some extent. Then funding. Do they need funding too? I'm not saying they don't deserve funding. I think they should, but it's in my mind, like from my perspective, this sort of like naive Westerners perspective, I don't quite understand how the funding thing necessarily. I mean, we've just already established that graffiti is a kind of it's got a democratic sort of like thing to it that you can do it with one can of spray paint. Where does funding come into it? What's it talking about?
Yeah, I think what's important to grasp here in the two interviews is that we're dealing with this model of Sweden where it's painted in many parts of the world as this sort of milk and honey land, if you know what I mean, where everything, they've got plenty of everything. And to be honest, it's a rich country, and they do have resources. But what Daniel was saying, and Christopher, is that there is a divide in particularly in Hammarkullen, but it's the same in Stockholm, with the suburbs, which are overwhelmingly poor and working class, and overwhelmingly immigrant areas. 80% of Hammarkullen was from some sort of immigrant or refugee background. I think in the interview, Daniel said 50% of Gothenburg overall. Okay, so you have to put that picture in your head that you've got this divide in the city. Now, when I went there, right, and you walk around the arts museum and all the different things in the city, there's loads of lovely things. There's big statues. There's all the things you see in a major, rich Western country. Okay, so when we talk about funding, they must have, I don't know the figures, but they must have a big budget for arts and culture. Actually, I was there at one point when there was a big arts and culture festival going on. And what we're talking about here is how much of the budget is going to equally amongst different sections of society to represent their art. And I think what we're saying here with Christopher and Daniel's points of view is that the majority of people's, it doesn't go to, and so you've got this very wealthy city, which has got these very poor areas on the outside. And when we talk about funding, we talk about, well, it was kind of allowed, you can have an interventionist, funding. So, maybe they do a kids graffiti project or something like that kind of stuff. But as he was also saying in the interview, that was kind of connected towards maybe a certain message that had to be given, and then that was again connected to the idea of gentrification of these areas. And that was connected in itself to the ending of social housing, which is a big issue. So wow, it expands, if you know what I mean.
So let's just see if I understand, because I'm hoping this will make it clearer for the listeners as well. There's a kind of a link between the zero tolerance situation, let's say, because there's been some negotiation there, hasn't there? And
I think let's clarify the zero tolerance. It was a law that happened some time ago, which I think is watered down in theory, but not watered down in practice. Yeah, and that's as I read it. You're allowed now. You're not allowed to do graffiti on private property, but you're allowed. But the idea of graffiti being an expressive aesthetic art is more accepted now than it was maybe 10 years ago.
It's got a shadow. The shadow of zero tolerance.
That's
much
the word.
falls.
Shadow of it. It's very right. Yeah,
I getcha. So that's in a way a kind of a forebearer of other issues. And then you've got the funding issue, and I think what they're saying is, look, there's this river of honey, but it only seems to flow towards the comfortable, the middle class. Why shouldn't that, like under with the zero tolerance issue sort of hovering in the background? We've also got the fact that there's no funding coming this way. I might be getting confused in that I'm sort of asking because and this is me trying to understand it all, but I felt like he was saying, "Where's the funding for the graffiti?"
I think what he was saying is not. I mean, we're obviously got murals and graffiti as the central theme here, and the aesthetic of street art. But I think what we're talking about here is a class and a racial divide about where resources go, in terms of the representation of people's arts and culture. Obviously that happens with jobs and lives and where they live, and there's a connection here. There's a really clear, I think it's really important to sort of point out there's a connection here between disparity.
My immediate thought, and again I'm very concerned that I could be coming from a very privileged and naive perspective, but I immediately thought, if that money is knocking around and you've got these people are survivors of very traumatic situations who have like made a real go of creating a vibrant and very humanitarian subculture within the greater culture of Sweden itself, where isn't Like, why isn't there like stuff like, you know, arts education and arts opportunities in that area being provided by the state? Because that's the first thing I would think. I mean, if it's been a big struggle for the adults, well, at least there should be encouragement of state-sanctioned encouragement of arts for the
I think
for the younger
here's
generation.
where I think there's a really interesting point here, Paul, and it's really it might seem very thin, but it's actually a small part of a big wedge, and what it is, and it's not necessarily easy to explain because we're both outsiders, but what there is I think there probably is some arts funding money, okay, and both Christopher and Danielle come from slightly different points in the process, but there's money for projects if it fits with a certain aesthetic quality. And if that,
I get it.
Then, and the point I made in the interview, because I think it's quite relevant, that artists come in, they make an area hip and cool, yeah, and then suddenly, you know, people want to live there, the middle class move in because it's cheaper and whatever, and that is the model of how, if you like, the neoliberalist model of gentrification. That's how they solve the problems of difficult areas. They move them to other areas, basically. And this is what I think is going on. It's like, yeah, you can have funding as long as it's not dirty graffiti, or as long as it's graffiti that doesn't say something politically we don't want to hear. And that's what's interesting about the Hammarkullen and other projects. And if you listen to Daniel, he talked about a project that I don't know, where I can't even remember what he called it, but he said, you know, I wish I hadn't done that one, you know, because I was connected to people I didn't want to be connected to, you know. And I think this is the question here. And what's interesting about him is he linked himself to the landless movement in South America, and he linked himself to the political and the people's struggle. And what both of them talk about is bottom up art creation, you know, rather than this top down. So I think what would happen is Gothenburg City Council would be very happy to throw some interventionist money at a community as long as it said the message they wanted. But the question here is, what does the community want? You know, what do they want their arts projects to be? And I think there's like a duality here. There's two models being in contention. One is a community or communities that want to self-organize, want to talk about things that are important for their young people and these kind of things. And the other is a sort of rigid conservative authority, which is softened a bit, but is saying, well, as long as it fits with our gentrification agenda.
Yeah, I agree with all of that, and it does worry me too. But I think, let's put it this way, it's like a test case for drawing out that kind of disparity. Okay, well, I'm going to sign off there because I think we've done enough, and we'll come back to this. It sounds like it's a story we're going to do more on as we go. But thanks a lot for that, Rob. Talk to you soon. I'm signing out now.
Okay then, so music this week we have by artist Wako, aka Nazca, and it's called Ellos, Dicen, which means in English, they say.
Es que la cosa aquí no cambia, seguimos igual. El rico ya es más rico y el pueblo sigue mal. El pobre en el olvido, en el barrio universal. Por eso señas de humo pa' poder olvidar. Es que la vida aquí no es fácil, uno que otro lance. Mucha trama, mucho loco, así es donde se nace. Se aprende a sonreír para sobrevivir. Y las rimas y los ritmos nos ayudan a existir. Perdemos la paciencia, caemos en violencia. Tomamos las armas en su de la demencia. Nos tienen donde quieren, centro de inteligencia. Ratas de laboratorio sobra la evidencia. Mientras discutimos por colores y un emblema. El enemigo es el gobierno que nos quema. Nos roban, nos matan, nos tienen donde quieren. Abran esos ojos, mira lo que viene. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí. Se les olvida donde yo crecí. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí. Se les olvida lo que yo viví. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, aunque la cosa sigue igual aquí. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, en el olvido seguimos aquí.
Sigo tirando esquina porque le entregué mi vida. Voy saliendo de la ruina solo con mi loca rima. Son enfermas y te muestran calavera. La muerte hoy te acecha en esta vida callejera. Los conciertos, los negocios y una que otra balacera. Me cuido del gobierno y de la ley que es traicionera. Nos quitan pertenencias y nos ponen las fronteras. Yo sigo en el barrio y vivo haciendo lo que quieran esta esfera. Tatuando, dando serenata, voy matando rata. Buscando mi respeto y no la plata. Mis logros pocos los consiguen, muchos tratan. Compito con mí mismo y eso a ellos los mata. Mi letra de protesta y el estilo siempre gasta. En el micro soy el masa y en la yeca haciendo pasta. Actúo como actúo porque el sueldo no alcanza. Y no por consumista sino para llenar la panza. Madafoca, basta.
Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, se les olvida donde yo crecí. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, se les olvida lo que yo viví. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, aunque la cosa sigue igual aquí. Ellos dicen que rezan por mí, en el olvido seguimos aquí.
Plagas apocalípticas acechan nuestras selvas, devastan la flora y fauna, imponiéndonos sus reglas. Entre siglas mueren bosques, edificándome en concreto. Leyes se hacen públicas y oposición decreto. Esta lucha causa justa, los gobiernos los asusta. Frustra ególatras ilustres, nuestra diestra letra busca. Ante su injusta justicia, despierta la anarquía. Círculos malignos, mi lápiz los desafía. Analizo, canalizo la pobreza que nos hizo seres dependientes de lo que un Dios no quiso. Sumisos como ovejas directas al matadero. Caminamos conformándonos con pocos de dinero. Regalamos nuestro tiempo, algo irrecuperable, a cambio de un trabajo y una vida miserable. Intolerable situación nos conduce a la extinción, suplantando a los humanos con androides o robots.
I hope you enjoyed today's show. If you have something to say to us, or even something to play, or just want to find out more about this podcast, then why don't you contact us on outa-space.com. That's outa-space.com. Alternatively, you can join our Facebook group, which is Outa-space Podcast. Okay, you take care now.